if we turn back to Jung for just a second, as I said, his model of the unconscious and its content is really remarkable, right? Oops, I gotta move this. What's wrong with this? Sorry. Yeah. His model of the unconscious and its content added a new kind of wrinkle to some of the metaphysical themes we've been talking about, right? And this is it. He said, I mean, this is such an amazing discovery, actually. It really is a pivot point, you know, and as a matter of fact, I don't find this in any other theorist. So it could be unique to him. He may have got the gist of it from Freud's comments, but it's really Jung who nailed this, and it is a central tenet of Jung. But it has so much impact on many things we've been talking about and in metaphysics in general, right? Imagine you got the ego, right? You've got the world, and you've got the unconscious. Clearly, every thinker knows that to the self, to the ego, the world is objective. Whether it really is or not, you know, is an interesting debate. But for argument's sake, and just for daily workaday efficacy in life, we claim that tables and chairs and nature, the mountains, right, other people are objective to the subjective self. What Jung brought to the table, and it really is something remarkable, and that is that the content of the id, or the content of the unconscious, is as objective to the self as is the content of the world. So the content of your own unconscious and the content of the world share something in common to the ego that's in the middle. They're both considered objective, meaning they're pushed away as non-selves, as the other. And how the hell that has been left out of so many narratives in the modern world, I could talk about for hours, because it's another one of these preposterous things. That's why I like to bring up these people, because they have things that should be in the narrative. They're just like a few minutes ago we pointed out how bankrupt these arguments are between the atheist and the non-atheist, right? Well, this one should be brought up, because to an ego is defined by how much it pushes away, how much it defends itself against. But it's not just the content of the world. This explains schizophrenia and things like that. We know that the schizophrenic is isolated and alienated from the world and highly scared and highly paranoid. Yes, but the Jungian includes the fact that he's equally as estranged from his own self, from content of his own self. And any definition of self or ego needs to bear this in mind, right? So it means then that what we call objectivity is actually an attribute of the self, right? In other words, it's not something taught to you by the world. It would be if the only thing we pushed away and made objective was worldly content. Well, then it follows that the world taught you how to be objective, how to objectify. But if this faculty is a psychic faculty, right, with psychic content, the argument is now that the ability to objectify is clearly and inviolably a capacity of self. What does that do? It supports idealism, not realism. Right? It supports very, very strongly the case for idealism. And it obliterates, or at least upsets, reductionist accounts of consciousness. Consciousness has this incredible power. So any statement that an atheist makes about what consciousness can do and what consciousness cannot do is spoken by his consciousness. Right? You can't think of a non-conscious being who can make a statement about consciousness. So reductionism is understood for the fallacy that it is when you realize that any statement about the mind is made by the mind. But there's not an atheist who will tell you that that's what they're doing. So I don't want to join into that kiddie pool. I think that's not for mature people to go in there and get involved in all those debates once you understand fundamental aspects about what the psyche really is, right? So again, in the light of what we're now exploring, we see that Jung was right to call the self an archetype, and he was right to call God an archetype. Because what he again said, remember, is that the numinous that you experience, the augustness of the sunset, the expanse of the stars, the contradictions of human life, right? Beauty, all of these wondrous things that we experience are not experienced by one person only. Their whole race experience it. And so they accumulate and accumulate and accumulate and become archetypal, meaning ideas that have constellated together to be very numinous, very powerful energetically, bioenergetically. Right? And therefore, because it is subjective, because it is part of our consciousness, that we then manifest sort of a God archetype, right? Experiencing from the world. How can a scientist who claims to be empirical dismiss it? So there's the nub of the whole argument, right? How dare a person who claims to be an empiricist doubt, query, right, and even get into arguments about the nature of God? Essentially, since that experience is born out of an empiricism, born out of worldly experience. So when you don't know your Jungs, as now most of America does not know, have you any idea what people are missing? And the absurd channels that they end up going down, like Tweedledum and Tweedledee? Absolutely absurd to dismiss psychoanalysis, Jung, because they've already answered it. Therefore, you don't need to spend a dime on any of these idiotic conferences and idiotic debates that you see on the media all the time. Because the whole thing is very logical and very empirical. You got Otto Rank, you've got Julian Jaynes, right? And you got Carl Jung and all the other ones we just mentioned. You've even got, Desjardins and Ken Wilber. And also, before we break, Jung's account that I've just given you, about the beauty of mystery. You've experienced mystery. And that accumulates and accumulates and accumulates into what we call the mystery of God. Right? But that theory also supports the idea of human freedom. Right? Because obviously, as I've just shown, the ego is free to choose or to reject or integrate content from that unconscious. So although it pushes it away, the world is pushed away and the unconscious is pushed away, but some are obviously, for anybody to be saying, there's integration as well. Is that choice and freedom at the bottom of that process? So even if you look at the unconscious, archetypes send us information through symbols, right? We are filtering it, but we also accept. Yeah, but you have to be free to choose even what the archetypes offer. So there's no determinism at all, right? The set experiences can indeed determine behavior, but only insofar as you forget that the ego allows content and rejects content, and that is the essence of freedom. Right? So there's many things being said here, right? There's a case for freedom, and there's the case also that the case for God, actually through Jung's work, does have an empirical grounding, right? Experiences of the natural world and the inherent mystery that cannot be denied over phylogenetic time. Which means the flip side of that is the archetype of God is not supernatural. It's invisible, like all archetypes, but it can no longer be supernatural. So all those monkeys that call themselves priests and all, we don't need to listen to them. They can just fuck off and die, right? Close the churches, it's all over. Any spiel about, supernaturalism, Jung has already showed you. And in fact, even if you have the phantasmagoria of supernaturalism, it came from exactly the same etiology we just explained, right? You get the supernatural too, unfortunately, because of the nature of the mind. Once you go into how the mind works, through a Rankian or a Jungian, or, with all of these people showing you the dynamics of the mind, this is how you come up with these things. And unless you know these dynamics, even if you tumble one system, another will come to replace it, which is what Blake and other people understood. And because the ego has this ability to push away, but also integrate, that's why divisions exist in the context we're talking about, right? Because the ego can act like a censor, pushing things away, pushing key aspects of ourselves away, which could lead to pathology. So the ego then has these self-imposed boundaries and limits. The most obvious one being the actual physical brain being divided. But the divides go all the way down between mind and body, mind and world, self and other. and all of that, interior and exterior, objective and subjective. You see? And after the break, we'll show where this leads, because if you take the things we've been saying about the internality and the processes of the psyche throwing up these archetypes, right? Then you can only then commit, or even these divisions, even these things we've talked about, the dualism that I've just implied, that then leads you directly to where we want to go, right? Which is into the deep mystical tradition that now will address God and his unconscious, you see. And themes like what I call the contrarium, which is just a new word for the old dichotomy of the dyadic nature of reality. We'll explore that in just a minute, because it all leads to that.